Welcome back. Picture a July morning in the year 1953, in a city that no longer looks like a city at all. The air smells of ash and wet plaster dust. A woman picks her way along a street that used to have a name, stepping over a broken roof tile, carrying a tin pot to a well that somehow still gives water. Somewhere behind her, children are playing in the shell of a building, using a fallen beam as a balance bar, laughing in a way that feels almost defiant. Overhead, the sky is quiet for the first time in months. No engines, no sirens, just wind moving through empty window frames. She does not know it yet, standing there in the rubble, but the ground beneath her feet is about to become one of the most ambitious, most tightly controlled experiments in city building of the entire 20th century. Today, using AI-assisted historical reconstructions, wartime photographs, and archival paintings, we are going to walk through that transformation together, block by block, decade by decade, from a flattened wartime ruin to a gleaming, symmetrical showcase capital built almost entirely from a blank slate. And by the end of this journey, you will see exactly how these same streets, squares, and monuments look today, filmed and photographed in the present, so you can compare the promise to the reality with your own eyes. Long before any of that, this stretch of land beside the Taedong River was something far more modest. Pyongyang's story does not begin with grand avenues or towering statues. It begins with fishermen, farmers, and traders drawn to a wide, slow-moving river that made an ideal crossing point and a natural hub for early settlement on the Korean peninsula. Archaeological evidence suggests people were living in this river basin for thousands of years before recorded history, drawn by fertile soil for growing millet and rice, and by the river itself, which offered both a source of food and a route for moving goods inland. Ancient walls and fortress remnants tell us this location was valued for defense as much as commerce, since a bend in the river created a natural barrier against invasion from certain directions. Over the centuries, the settlement here grew into a capital for a succession of Korean kingdoms, most notably serving as a center of power for the ancient kingdom of Gojoseon and later Goguryeo, two of the great early Korean states. The people living in those early centuries could not have imagined a city of grand marble facades and mile-wide plazas. They knew wooden granaries, packed earth city walls, and quiet river docks. They had no way of knowing that this same ground would one day be leveled almost completely by modern warfare, only to be rebuilt as a rigid, idealized vision of an entirely different kind of society. To understand Pyongyang at its height, in the form most recognizable today, you have to understand what happened to it first. By the end of the Korean War in 1953, an extraordinary bombing campaign had reduced the city to something close to a wasteland. Contemporary estimates suggest that the overwhelming majority of buildings in the city core were destroyed or severely damaged, leaving very few pre-war structures standing. It was, in a very real sense, the closest thing to a truly blank canvas that any 20th century city planner could ask for. Out of that devastation, a new master plan emerged, drafted with support from Soviet-aligned planners and heavily influenced by the wide boulevards, monumental scale, and rigid symmetry of Soviet socialist urban design. Streets were widened to as much as 100 meters across in places, wide enough to double as parade grounds and to make ordinary pedestrians feel small beneath the scale of the state. Apartment blocks rose in matching rows, uniform in height and color, built quickly using standardized concrete panel construction to house a population that had lost nearly everything. At the heart of it all sat Kim Il-sung Square, a vast open plaza roughly 75,000 square meters in size, paved in pale stone and flanked by government buildings finished in muted grays and soft ochres, designed explicitly for mass rallies, military parades, and choreographed demonstrations of loyalty involving tens of thousands of participants moving in unison. The air above the square would fill, on parade days, with the low rumble of marching boots, amplified patriotic music played through loudspeakers mounted on nearby buildings, and the crisp snap of thousands of paper flowers and flags being raised on cue. Even this centerpiece was never quite finished in spirit. Buildings around the square were repeatedly renovated, repainted, and reworked across decades as political messaging shifted, proof that this was a living stage set constantly being adjusted, not a monument frozen in time. The spiritual and civic heart of a place like ancient Rome or medieval Europe might have been a temple or a cathedral. In Pyongyang's case, that role was filled by an entirely different kind of institution, one built around ideology rather than religion in the traditional sense. Grand structures such as the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun, originally built as a presidential residence and later converted into a mausoleum, functioned as the closest thing the city had to a sacred site, a place of ritual visitation, solemn ceremony, and carefully managed reverence. Nearby, the Mansudae Grand Monument holds two enormous bronze statues, each around 20 meters tall, standing on a raised platform where citizens are expected to bow and lay flowers on state holidays, a practice that blends civic duty with something resembling religious observance. Government functioned through a tightly centralized structure headquartered in buildings surrounding the main square, where policy was set and disseminated downward rather than debated openly, a system entirely different from the marketplaces of open argument found in ancient democracies. And yet, layered beneath this modern ideological architecture, older Korean civic and religious traditions never fully disappeared. Ancient Buddhist temple sites such as Gwangbop Temple, tucked into the wooded slopes of Mount Taesong just outside the city, survived the war and the rebuilding, offering a quieter, older rhythm of incense smoke and stone lanterns that predates the planned socialist capital by well over 1,000 years. Away from the monuments, ordinary daily life in Pyongyang carried its own distinct texture. By the later decades of the 20th century, the city's population had grown from a wartime low of a few hundred thousand to well over 2 million residents, though access to living in the capital itself has historically been restricted, treated as a privilege granted according to political loyalty and family background rather than open to anyone who wished to move there. A typical morning might begin with residents walking or cycling to work past uniform apartment blocks, some more than 20 stories tall, their concrete facades sometimes decorated with mosaic murals depicting industrial progress or agricultural abundance. Public transportation ran on a deep, ornately decorated subway system, its stations finished with chandeliers, marble columns, and painted ceiling murals, a striking contrast to the utilitarian apartment blocks above ground. Markets, both officially sanctioned and, over time, increasingly informal, became places where the sounds of bartering, the smell of grilling corn or steamed rice cakes, and the low hum of transistor radios blended into the everyday noise of the city. Loudspeakers mounted on street corners and inside workplaces broadcast a mix of news, music, and ideological messaging throughout the day, becoming such a constant backdrop to city life that longtime residents often described barely noticing it anymore. Class divisions, while officially downplayed, were visible in subtle ways. Differences in housing quality, access to certain shops, and even distance from the ceremonial center of the city often correlated with a family's political standing, creating a hierarchy that shaped daily experience even in a system built around the promise of equality. One landmark captures civic pride and public spectacle better than almost any other. The Rungrado May Day Stadium, completed in 1989 on an island in the Taedong River. With a listed seating capacity of around 114,000, it stands among the largest stadiums ever constructed anywhere in the world, its exterior shaped into 16 arching ribs meant to evoke either a blossoming magnolia flower or, as some observers have noted, a parachute canopy caught mid-descent. The stadium became best known for hosting the Ararang Mass Games, an extraordinary large-scale performance combining tens of thousands of gymnasts, dancers, and schoolchildren holding colored placards that flip in sequence to form enormous moving images across an entire stadium section. Choreography rehearsed for months and requiring a level of coordinated precision rarely attempted anywhere else on Earth. For decades, an invitation to perform in the mass games was treated as a mark of honor for young participants, even as the grueling rehearsal schedules involved raised persistent questions from outside observers about the toll such demands placed on children and teenagers. For the city's residents, the stadium became a symbol of collective achievement and national spectacle, a place where individual identity dissolved, at least for a few hours, into something larger and more uniform. If the stadium represented collective spectacle, privilege in Pyongyang took a far more private and hidden form. Rather than grand aristocratic villas open to public admiration, the residences and retreats associated with the ruling Kim family and top officials were designed for concealment rather than display. Walled compounds and lakeside retreats built well outside the public eye, reportedly featuring imported furnishings, private cinemas, and expansive grounds landscaped with imported trees and ornamental gardens. Satellite imagery and defector testimony over the years have described sprawling estates equipped with private train stations, swimming pools, and elaborate leisure facilities, an extraordinary contrast to the tightly rationed daily life experienced by ordinary residents just a short distance away. Whatever luxury existed behind those walls, however, offered no lasting protection from the same forces of political change, economic hardship, and historical upheaval that eventually reshaped the fortunes of the wider population. Privilege in this system has always depended entirely on political favor, and political favor, throughout the 20th century, proved to be one of the least stable things a person could hold on to. The turning point for Pyongyang was not a single dramatic collapse but a violent unmaking followed by an equally deliberate remaking, and it unfolded across a matter of months rather than centuries. Beginning in the summer of 1950 and escalating dramatically through 1951 and into 1952, the city became one of the most heavily bombed urban targets of the entire war, subjected to sustained aerial campaigns that intensified as ground fighting shifted back and forth across the peninsula. By some post-war assessments, less than 10% of the city's pre-war buildings remained standing by the armistice in July 1953, an almost total erasure of the built environment. Residents who lived through it later described nights spent sheltering in makeshift dugouts and tunnels as the ground shook and the sky glowed orange from fires burning across entire districts. In the moment, many likely believed the destruction was simply the latest and worst chapter of a war that had already dragged on for years, without any sense of what would rise in its place. What was actually happening, viewed with the benefit of hindsight, was the near-total erasure of an old Korean provincial capital, clearing the ground, quite literally, for an entirely new kind of city to be imposed on it within the span of a single decade. In the years immediately following the armistice, the city existed in a strange, liminal state, part refugee camp, part construction site. Emergency shelters gave way slowly to permanent housing as Soviet and Chinese-aligned reconstruction aid and expertise flowed in, and the population that had scattered during the war gradually returned or was resettled. Amid the urgency of rebuilding, remnants of the old pre-war city were often bulldozed rather than preserved, seen as obstacles to the new master plan rather than as heritage worth saving, and much of what had defined Pyongyang before the war, its older wooden architecture, its pre-war street patterns, its more organic, unplanned layout, was deliberately left behind and largely forgotten in the rush toward a symmetrical, ideologically coherent replacement. The systematic rediscovery of what this rebuilding actually produced came gradually, not through archaeological excavation but through the slow trickle of outside access. Diplomatic visits, tightly managed tourist tours beginning in earnest in the 1980s and expanding further in later decades, defector testimony, and eventually high-resolution satellite imagery that allowed outside researchers to study the city's precise layout, growth, and internal contradictions from a distance for the first time. What surprised many outside observers was not simply the scale of the monuments, which had always been visible in state propaganda photographs, but the details visible only up close. The uniformity stretching for city blocks in every direction, the eerie quiet of streets during non-parade hours and later, the visible cracks in the propaganda image itself, aging infrastructure, patched facades, and, during periods of severe economic hardship in the 1990s, evidence of infrastructure strain even. In the capital that had been built to project strength above all else. It is worth pausing here, briefly, to remember that behind every wide avenue and towering monument in this city were, and are, real people living ordinary lives shaped by extraordinary circumstances. Families raised children in those uniform apartment blocks. Workers built those wide boulevards with their own hands. People fell in love, celebrated birthdays, and mourned losses beneath those same murals and slogans. A planned city built around ideology is still underneath everything, a place where human beings tried to live full lives within the boundaries they were given. Today, if you could walk through Pyongyang with a permitted guide, much of what we have described would still be standing, carefully maintained as a matter of national priority even during periods of broader economic difficulty. Kim Il-sung Square remains the ceremonial heart of the city, still used for parades and mass demonstrations, its paving stones freshly repainted before major anniversaries. The Kumsusan Palace of the Sun still stands as a mausoleum, now housing the preserved bodies of both Kim Il-sung and his son Kim Jong-il, and continues to receive organized visits from citizens and occasional foreign tourists under strict protocol. The Mansudae Grand Monument's bronze statues remain in place, now depicting both Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il side by side, still the site of mandatory feeling floral tributes on national holidays. The ornate subway stations continue running, their chandeliers and murals largely unchanged from their original installation, functioning as both practical transit and something closer to a museum experience for the small number of outside visitors permitted to ride them. The Rungrado May Day Stadium still looms over its river island, its mass games performances staged intermittently in recent years, drawing both national pride and renewed scrutiny from human rights observers regarding the participants involved. And the walled estates associated with the ruling family, insofar as outside researchers can determine through satellite imagery, remain active and maintained, their internal details as hidden from public view today as they were decades ago. Older layers of the city's much longer history persist quietly at its edges, with temples like Kwangbop still standing on Mount Taesong, largely overlooked by the itineraries built around the newer, ideologically driven core, a reminder that beneath even the most deliberately constructed modern capital, older histories continue to breathe. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, walking through the transformation of a city built almost entirely from the ashes of war into one of the most tightly choreographed urban spaces on Earth. If you enjoyed this journey, let me know in the comments which place you would like to see brought back to life next. And if there is a detail I missed or a perspective you think deserves more attention, I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts below. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.